Cole Harrison, you're under arrest. The words cracked across the frozen ranch yard like a gunshot, and before the giant biker could even turn his head, 6 sheriff cruisers had already sealed off every exit. Neighbors froze mid-step. Phones rose into the air. A monster in leather, everyone whispered, finally caught. But when his fragile daughter came screaming through the front door, and the sheriff's eyes dropped to a small, faded patch stitched inside that biker's vest, his face went white, because that patch didn't belong to any motorcycle club. It belonged to a man who had saved his family 20 years ago, a man everyone believed was dead. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, tap the bell, and stay with me all the way to the end, because this one is going to surprise you more than once. And down in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled. 6 vehicles, that was what it took to bring down one man. Sheriff Ethan Walker had done this 100 times before drug raids, domestic disputes, the occasional bar fight that spilled into the street. But he had never assembled 6 units for a single arrest warrant on a stolen property charge. Not until today. Not until the name on the warrant read Cole Harrison. The convoy rolled up the gravel drive just after 7 in the morning, dust kicking up behind the tires, red and blue lights spinning silently against the pale winter sky. Deputies spilled out before the cars had even stopped rolling, hands resting on holsters, eyes locked on the old ranch house at the end of the lane. Word had already spread through Redwood Valley faster than the sirens themselves. By the time the sheriff's boots hit the dirt, a small crowd had gathered along the fence line, flannel jackets, steaming coffee mugs, arms crossed tight against the cold. Nobody wanted to miss this. Finally, someone muttered from the crowd, "Knew that biker trash would get what's coming." "Always figured there was something rotten under all that leather," said another. Sheriff Walker didn't look at them. His eyes were fixed on the porch where Cole Harrison stood in silence, arms loose at his sides, watching the deputies fan out around his property like he'd been expecting this his entire life. He was a big man, 6'4" of scarred muscle wrapped in a worn leather vest, sleeves of faded tattoos running down both forearms, a gray streaked beard that hadn't seen a razor in weeks. On the back of that vest, stitched in bold letters, sat the patch that had made this town whisper his name for 11 years straight, Hell's Angels. To Redwood Valley, that patch had always meant one thing: danger, trouble, a man not to be trusted. "Cole Harrison," Sheriff Walker called out again, louder this time, his voice steady but heavy with something that felt almost like reluctance. "You're under arrest for grand theft and possession of stolen agricultural equipment." Cole didn't move. He didn't run. He didn't reach for anything. He simply raised both hands, slow and deliberate, palms open toward the sky. "Figured you'd come eventually," Cole said quietly. "Just didn't figure it'd be 6 cars for an old man in a tractor." A ripple of nervous laughter broke through a few of the deputies, quickly swallowed by the tension in the air. Deputy Marcus Cole, no relation, just an unfortunate coincidence of names the department joked about, constantly stepped forward with a pair of handcuffs glinting in the early light. "Hands behind your back, sir." Cole exhaled slowly through his nose, turned, and began to comply. That was when the front door of the house flew open so hard it slammed against the wall. "Dad?" Every head in that yard turned at once. Emily Harrison came running down the porch steps in nothing but a thin sweater and socks, her blonde hair whipping loose around a face gone paper white with panic. 21 years old, barely 5'4", and moving with a desperation that made 3 deputies instinctively reach toward her before realizing she wasn't a threat. She was terrified. "Dad, what's happening? What did you do? What's going on?" "Emily, stay back," Cole said, his voice suddenly sharp, urgent, all business. "Stay on the porch. Don't come any closer. Sweetheart, please." But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her hands were already shaking, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps that made Deputy Marcus freeze, mid-motion, handcuffs still dangling from his fingers. "Sir, we need her to calm down," he said quietly to the sheriff. "Her breathing?" "I know." Sheriff Walker snapped back, already moving. He knew. Everyone in this town knew about Emily Harrison's heart. A congenital condition since birth, the kind that made every doctor who examined her use words like fragile and monitor closely and avoid extreme stress. The kind of condition where a single moment of panic wasn't just emotional, it was medically dangerous. "Emily." Cole's voice cracked, and for the first time that morning, the massive biker who had stood unmoved in front of 6 armed deputies Looked like he might come apart at the seams. Baby, look at me. Look at me, not them. I need you to breathe. Slow, okay? Slow like we practiced. She was crying now, gasping, one hand pressed flat against her own chest as if she could hold her racing heart in place through sheer will. They can't take you, Dad, they can't. Emily. The sharpness in his voice this time wasn't anger. It was fear, pure naked fear, the kind that had nothing to do with handcuffs or charges or 6 sheriff's cars parked in his yard. Breathe in through your nose. Hold it. Now let it out slow. That's it. That's my girl. The yard had gone completely silent. Even the whispering neighbors along the fence had stopped their murmuring, watching this hardened, tattooed outlaw talk his daughter down from a panic attack with the gentleness of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. Because he had. Sheriff Walker stood there, and for one strange moment, something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of doubt. It vanished as quickly as it came, buried under 11 years of assumptions he'd built about this man without ever once sitting down and actually talking to him. Sir, Deputy Marcus said again, lower this time. Sheriff, maybe we should cuff him, Walker said. Let's get this done before it gets worse for everyone. Cole's jaw tightened, but he nodded, turning his back toward Marcus, arms folding behind him without resistance. The cold metal clicked shut around his wrists, and somewhere in the crowd someone actually clapped. A single ugly sound in the freezing morning air. Emily flinched like she'd been struck. You people don't know him, she screamed at the fence line, her voice raw and breaking. You don't know anything about him. He's not what you think he is. Nobody answered her. Nobody ever did. What none of them understood, what not one single person leaning against that fence line with their judgment already made had ever bothered to find out, was what actually happened inside that old ranch house every single morning before the sun came up. At 5:30, while the rest of Redwood Valley was still asleep, Cole Harrison was already awake, moving quietly through a kitchen lit only by the glow of the stove light, laying out 7 small pill bottles in a precise row on the counter. He knew the name of every medication by heart. He knew the exact dosage, the exact time, the exact order they had to be taken in, because one mistake, even a small one, could put his daughter in a hospital bed. He kept a laminated card taped inside the cabinet door, with emergency numbers and written in his own handwriting. The cardiologist in Bozeman, the pharmacy, the hospital, and beneath all of it underlined twice, call me first always, no matter what. He had missed exactly one of Emily's cardiology appointments in 9 years, and that was because his own truck had broken down on the highway, so he'd flagged down a stranger and hitchhiked 40 miles rather than let her sit in that waiting room alone. This was the man the town saw as a criminal before a single piece of evidence was ever presented. His brothers understood him differently. The men who rode beside him, the ones the town whispered about every time their motorcycles rumbled down Main Street, were the same men who had shown up unannounced the week Emily was hospitalized for a valve complication, filling the waiting room with leather vests and quiet, steady presence until 3 in the morning. They were the ones who rebuilt his fence line after a storm tore through the valley 2 winters ago, refusing every dollar he tried to hand them. They called themselves brothers, and to Cole, after burying his wife 11 years earlier, that word had come to mean something the rest of the town would never understand. And 20 feet from where he now sat handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, hidden beneath the shed roof where nobody thought to look, a small camera blinked quietly, recording everything. As Cole was guided toward the open door of the cruiser, a young deputy named Noah Bennett hung back near the equipment shed. His eyes narrowed at something on the ground that nobody else had bothered to notice. Tire tracks. Fresh ones running along the edge of the property line, cutting through frost that hadn't melted yet. Tracks that led directly to where the stolen harvesting equipment had supposedly been hidden, tracks that were far too narrow, far too new to belong to any vehicle Cole Harrison owned. Noah crouched down slowly, careful not to draw attention, and pulled out his phone to snap a quiet photo. Something about this didn't sit right. It hadn't sat right from the moment the anonymous tip came in 3 days ago. A tip from a block number delivered with suspiciously precise coordinates for exactly where the stolen machinery could be found. Hey, Bennett, Marcus called out, already halfway to the cruiser with Cole in tow. You coming, or you gonna stand there staring at dirt all day? Yeah, Noah said, straightening quickly, sliding his phone back into his pocket. Yeah, coming. But his eyes lingered on those tracks a second longer than they should have. As Cole was guided toward the open door of the cruiser, ducking his head to fit his massive frame into the back seat, Sheriff Walker stepped in close for one final look, the kind of look a lawman gives a man he's about to take away for a long time. That was when he saw it. Cole's vest had shifted slightly during the struggle to get him seated, the inner lining flipping outward for just a moment, and there stitched into the fabric where no one would ever think to look was a small patch. Faded almost to nothing. Water-stained. Decades old. It wasn't a motorcycle club symbol. It was something else entirely. Sheriff Walker's entire body went rigid. His breath caught somewhere in his throat, and for a moment the noise of the yard, the crying, the whispering crowd, the crackle of the radio on his shoulder, all of it dissolved into a ringing silence in his ears. He knew that patch. He had spent 20 years trying to forget that exact patch, and the man who wore it, a man he'd been told was dead. A man his family owed everything to. A man he had searched for quietly, hopelessly for 2 decades without ever finding a trace. "Sheriff?" Marcus's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Sheriff, you good? We need to close the door." Ethan Walker didn't answer right away. His hand hovered near the doorframe, his eyes locked on that small faded emblem half hidden inside the vest of the man he had just arrested. Sheriff Walker. "Wait," Ethan finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, so quiet that only Cole, sitting silently in the back seat with his hands cuffed behind him, could actually hear it. "Wait just a second." Cole's eyes lifted slowly to meet the sheriff's, and something passed between them. In that moment, something neither man said out loud, but both of them understood completely. Because Cole Harrison had been waiting 11 years for someone to finally notice. And now kneeling beside a squad car in the freezing Montana morning, with his daughter sobbing behind a line of stunned deputies and half the town watching in silence, Sheriff Ethan Walker finally had. "Close the door," Ethan said abruptly, straightening up, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Get him to the station. I'll follow behind." Marcus hesitated, confused by the sudden change in his sheriff's demeanor, but he did as he was told, shutting the door with a heavy click. As the cruiser pulled away down the long gravel drive, Emily broke free from the deputy, trying to comfort her, and ran alongside it for a moment, her palm slapping against the window where her father's face watched her from inside. "I love you, Dad. I love you. Don't say anything. Don't say anything until the lawyer gets there, please." Cole pressed his cuffed hands as close to the glass as he could manage, mouthing 3 words back to her that made her stumble to a stop in the middle of the road, tears streaming freely down her face. "I love you." The cruiser turned onto the highway and disappeared around the bend, leaving Emily standing alone in the cold, watching the dust settle behind it. Behind her, Sheriff Walker remained frozen beside his own vehicle, staring down at nothing, his mind hurtling backward through 20 years in the span of a single heartbeat, back to a night of screaming wind and rising black water, back to his wife's terrified face pressed against a cracked car window, back to his 6-year-old son's tiny hands clawing at a seatbelt that wouldn't release, back to the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere in that flood, who had gone under the surface, gone to the surface 3 times, who had pulled his entire family out of a sinking vehicle and vanished into the storm before anyone could even ask his name. Ethan Walker had spent 2 decades believing that man was dead. He had just placed handcuffs on him. Sheriff Noah Bennett's voice cut through the fog in his head. The young deputy was standing a few feet away, holding his phone out uncertainly. "Sir, I think you need to see this. Those tire tracks by the shed, they don't match anything Harrison owns. And that anonymous tip that came in, I pulled the call records this morning before we left the station." Ethan blinked hard, forcing himself back into the present, back into the job in front of him. "What about it?" "It didn't come from a blocked number like the report says," Noah said, carefully glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one else was close enough to hear. "It came from a burner phone, one that was purchased 2 days before the call in cash at a gas station 40 miles outside of town." And Noah swallowed hard. "And the security footage from that gas station just came back this morning. Sheriff, I think somebody set Cole Harrison up, and I think I know exactly who." Richard Vaughn had not always hated Cole Harrison. In fact, 3 years ago, he had smiled at the man across a mahogany table and offered him what he considered a generous number for the ranch, $2 million for 1,100 acres of land that geologists working quietly for Vaughn's company had confirmed sat above one of the richest mineral deposits in the state. Cole had turned him down without even blinking. "This land's got my wife buried on it," Cole had told him that day, standing up from the table before the meeting had even properly started. "It's got my daughter's whole life in it. You can offer me $20 million, and the answer's still no." Vaughn didn't take rejection well. He never had. And over the following 18 months, Redwood Valley had quietly started falling apart around Cole Harrison in ways that never quite connected back to any one source. A fence line cut clean through in the middle of the night. Feed contaminated just badly enough to sicken 3 head of cattle without killing them outright. A tractor's brake line mysteriously worn through, discovered only after Cole nearly rolled it down a hillside. Small things. Deniable things. The kind of things a sheriff's department chalks up to bad luck or teenage vandals, never once connecting them to the polished businessman who sat on the town council and donated generously to the annual county fair. Then 3 days ago, that anonymous tip had come in precise coordinates, leading deputies straight to a stash of stolen harvesting equipment hidden in Cole's back pasture equipment, reported missing from a neighboring farm 2 counties over. Equipment Cole Harrison had never laid eyes on in his life. Across the valley, in an office with a perfect view of 1,100 acres of ranch land he had wanted for 3 years. Richard Vaughn set down his coffee cup, opened a fresh contract on his desk, and smiled. "One down," he murmured. "Now let's see how fast that little farm falls apart without him." He had no idea that a faded patch stitched inside a leather vest had just changed everything he thought he had won. And back at the county jail, as deputies led Cole Harrison down a fluorescent-lit hallway toward a holding cell, the massive biker who had spent 11 years being feared, misunderstood, and quietly judged by an entire town allowed himself one small, tired smile. Because after 20 years of silence, someone had finally seen the truth stitched into the lining of his vest. The question now was whether that truth would be enough to save him before Richard Vaughn's plan to destroy him completely was already too far along to stop. Orchestrated 5,300-word narrative continuation with dialogue-heavy storytelling, strategic plot escalation, and integrated emotional beats. Orchestrated 5,300-word narrative continuation with dialogue, heavy storytelling, strategic plot escalation, and integrated emotional beats, Part 2. The holding cell door hadn't even closed behind him before the questions started stacking up in Cole's mind like debris behind a dam. Emily. Was she breathing right? Was someone counting her pulse? Was anyone even paying attention to the difference between a panic attack and something worse? "Sit tight, Harrison," the booking officer said, sliding a clipboard through the slot. "Lawyer's already been called. Somebody named Denise Whitfield. She's on her way." Cole's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Denise Whitfield doesn't take cases like mine." "Guess she does now." The officer shrugged. "Your daughter called half the county before she called a lawyer. Had 6 guys on Harleys pull up outside the station in under 20 minutes. You want to explain that to me?" Cole allowed himself the smallest, tiredest smile of the entire morning. Family. Outside in the gravel lot behind the sheriff's station, 6 motorcycles idled in a tight, silent row. Big men in leather vests stood beside them with their arms crossed, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. Word had already ripped through the club's phone tree the moment Emily's voice cracked over the line. "Dad's been arrested. They're saying he stole equipment. Please, I don't know what to do." That was all it took. Tank Morrison, the club's oldest member at 61, had been the first to swing a leg over his bike. "We ride," he'd said, and 11 years of brotherhood didn't need a second sentence. Now they stood outside the station like a wall of leather in silence, and every deputy who walked past the window gave them a wide and easy berth. "They're not going anywhere," Marcus muttered to another deputy inside. "That's not a protest, that's a message." Emily sat in the station's waiting area, knees bouncing, hands wrapped so tightly around a paper coffee cup that the sides had crumpled inward. Tank had driven her there himself, refusing to let her get behind a wheel with her hands shaking the way they were. "He didn't do this," she said for the 4th time. "Not really to Tank, not really to anyone. You know he didn't do this." "I know," Tank said quietly. "Question is whether the people in that building know it too." That was the moment Sheriff Ethan Walker walked past the waiting room window and froze. He hadn't meant to stop. He'd meant to walk straight through to his office, shut the door, and figure out what in God's name he was supposed to do with the fact that a dead man was sitting in his holding cell. But Emily's face stopped him cold, that same raw, desperate fear he'd seen in his own son's eyes 20 years ago, trapped behind glass with black water rising. He almost said something. He didn't. He kept walking because he didn't trust his own voice yet, and he needed to be alone with the file box sitting in the bottom drawer of his desk before he said a single word to anyone. The box had been there for years untouched, gathering dust behind old evidence logs. Silver Creek 2004 written in his own handwriting across the lid in permanent marker that had faded to gray. He hadn't opened it in over a decade. He hadn't needed to. Some nights the memory opened itself without any help at all. His hands weren't entirely steady as he lifted the lid. Newspaper clippings, a water-damaged incident report, a photograph of the overpass where the flood had swallowed half the valley in under 6 hours, the kind of flood that came once in a generation and left bodies in places nobody thought to look for weeks. And beneath all of it, a single sheet of paper, a volunteer rescue roster, hand-copied by a records clerk from radio dispatch logs, because half the original paperwork had been destroyed in the flood itself. Most of the names on it were smudged, illegible, lost to 20 years of humidity and neglect. But one name near the bottom wasn't. C. Harrison Volunteer Swiftwater. Ethan sat back so hard his chair scraped against the floor. "No," he said out loud to no one. "No, that can't be the same." But he already knew. He'd known the second he saw that patch flash inside Cole's vest. He'd known it in his gut before his mind had even caught up. 20 years of grief and gratitude and unanswered questions collapsed into a single line on a water-stained page, and Ethan Walker realized his hands were shaking now, too. He stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. "Marcus!" His voice cracked through the station hallway. "I need the holding cell opened. Now." Marcus appeared in the doorway, startled. "Sheriff, what's—" "Now, Marcus." Down the hall, past the booking desk, past the wide-eyed clerk who'd never heard the sheriff raise his voice like that, Ethan pushed through the door into the holding block, and for a moment just stood there staring at the man sitting quietly on the bench, forearms resting on his knees, waiting. "You've been waiting a long time for someone to ask you," Ethan said. Cole lifted his head slowly. Something in his eyes shifted, not surprise, not relief. Recognition, like a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head and still didn't know exactly how it would feel when it finally arrived. "Ask me what sheriff," Ethan's throat tightened. "Silver Creek, 2004. The overpass on Route 9. A minivan going under a woman and a 6-year-old boy trapped inside." His voice broke on the next word. "That was my wife. That was my son." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Marcus, hovering near the door, actually stepped back, sensing something too large and too private for him to witness. Cole didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough, careful. "I was just doing my job," he said. "I didn't have a name to give anybody that night. Didn't seem like the moment for introductions." "You disappeared," Ethan said, his voice cracking further. "I looked for you. Years, Cole. I put in requests to every fire department, every rescue unit, every swift water team in 3 states. Nobody had a record of you. Nobody even knew your name. Wasn't registered with any department," Cole said quietly. "Was a private contractor doing flood response back then. Contract ran out 3 weeks after Silver Creek. Company folded. Records went nowhere." He paused, jaw tightening. "And then I came home, and 6 months later my wife got sick, and I stopped chasing rescues and started chasing doctors instead. Didn't have room left in my life to go looking for the family I pulled out of a river one night in the middle of a storm." Ethan pressed both palms flat against the bars, his forehead nearly touching the cold metal. "You saved my whole family, and I put handcuffs on you this morning in front of half this town." "You didn't know," Cole said. "Nobody could have known. That's not on you, Ethan." Hearing his first name out of this man's mouth hit Ethan like a physical blow. "I need to get you out of here," Ethan said, straightening something hardening behind his eyes. Now something that looked less like grief and more like resolve. "Today, whatever it takes." "Careful," Cole said, a warning creeping into his voice. "Whoever set this up, they're not amateurs. Somebody wanted me arrested badly enough to plant evidence, fake a tip, and time it perfectly. You go pulling strings too fast, too obvious, you're going to spook them into doing something worse. Worse than framing an innocent man." Cole's eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward the direction of the waiting room where his daughter sat. "They know exactly where to hurt me if this doesn't work the way they planned," he said quietly. "And it isn't going to be me they come after next." Ethan's stomach dropped. 2 miles away, in an office with a view of 1,100 acres he still believed would eventually be his, Richard Vaughn wasn't smiling anymore. His phone buzzed against the desk and the name on the screen made his jaw tighten. Warren County Records. Talk to me, Vaughn said, answering on the second ring. We've got a problem, the voice on the other end said. Deputy Bennett pulled the gas station footage this morning. He's got the burner phone purchase on camera, time-stamped. 2 days before the tip came in. Vaughn's fingers tightened around the phone. Is his face on it? No, hood up cash, only no card trail. But it's enough to raise questions if he keeps pulling threads. Then somebody needs to make sure he stops pulling threads. Bennett's a Boy Scout, Richard. You can't buy him. He filed a formal request this morning to reopen the chain of custody on the equipment. If that gets approved, they'll trace the ownership records back further than we can control. Vaughn was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the ranch land in the distance, at the exact spot where his engineers had marked survey stakes 18 months ago, before Cole Harrison ever knew his land was worth anything to anyone. Then we don't stop Bennett, Vaughn said finally. We discredit him. Every young deputy's got something in his past he doesn't want dragged into daylight. Find it. And if there's nothing to find, there's always something to find, Vaughn said, and hung up. He didn't know yet that 2 miles away in a jail cell that should have kept his problem neatly contained, the sheriff of Redwood Valley had just discovered the one thing that could unravel his entire plan, a 20-year-old debt that made Ethan Walker the last person on earth Vaughn wanted standing between him and Cole Harrison. By early afternoon, Noah Bennett sat in the records room with 3 case boxes spread across the table, cross-referencing ownership documents for the stolen harvesting equipment against a state agricultural database. Something kept snagging in his mind, small and persistent, like a splinter he couldn't quite locate. The equipment's serial numbers matched a report filed by a farm 2 counties over. Fine, except the report had been filed only 4 days before the anonymous tip came in an unusually tight window for equipment to be stolen, transported, hidden on Cole's property, and then reported through official channels, all without a single overlapping timestamp that made logical sense. Somebody planted this in a hurry, Noah muttered to himself. Talking to yourself now, Bennett? Captain Reyes leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, his tone carrying an edge that hadn't been there yesterday. Just going over the equipment chain of custody, sir. Something's not lining up. Leave it, Reyes said flatly. Case is closed. Evidence was found on Harrison's property in Harrison's name. That's enough for arraignment. Noah frowned. Sir, with respect, if the timeline's compromised, the whole case could fall apart in court. I filed a request this morning to... I saw your request. Reyes's voice dropped lower, tighter. And I'm telling you to withdraw it. The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment, and something in Reyes's expression, a flicker of discomfort quickly masked, told Noah everything he needed to know without a single additional word being spoken. Yes, sir, Noah said carefully. He waited until Reyes's footsteps faded down the hallway, before pulling out his phone and quietly photographing every document on that table one by one. Whatever was happening in this department went higher than a burner phone and a set of forged tire tracks. And if his own captain was suddenly this nervous about a records request, Noah had a sick feeling he already knew whose name would eventually surface at the center of it. That was the moment his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Drop it. This is your only warning. Noah's hands went cold around the phone. He looked up instinctively, scanning the empty hallway, the quiet records room, the reflection of fluorescent lights against the window glass. Somebody was watching him. Somebody close enough to know exactly what he'd requested that morning. Across town, in the waiting room of the sheriff's station, Emily's phone rang, and for one hopeful second, her heart leapt, thinking it might be news about her father. It wasn't. Miss Harrison. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, cold in a way that made her stomach twist immediately. This is First Valley Bank. I'm calling regarding the ranch's operating loan. We've received notice of a lien filing against the property this morning, effective immediately. A lien? What lien? There's no lien on our land. There is now, Miss Harrison, filed by Vaughn Development Group citing an outstanding contractual dispute. Until it's resolved, the bank is required to freeze the account associated with the property. Emily's vision blurred. You can't do that. That account pays for my medication. That account pays for everything. I understand this is difficult news. I'm sorry. The line went dead and Emily stood frozen in the middle of the waiting room, the phone slipping from fingers that had gone completely numb, her breath coming faster, shorter, the edges of the room beginning to tilt. Emily, Tank was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room in 3 long strides. Emily, look at me. What happened? They froze the account, she whispered. They froze everything. Tank, I can't breathe, right? Something's wrong, I can't. Her knees buckled. Tank caught her before she hit the floor, lowering her, gently shouting for help, even as three other bikers rushed forward, even as the station clerk grabbed the phone to call an ambulance, even as Sheriff Walker burst out of the holding block corridor at the sound of the commotion, his heart lurching at the sight of Emily Harrison collapsed on the waiting room floor, her lips beginning to take on a faint, terrifying tinge of blue. "Get her oxygen now!" Ethan barked, dropping to his knees beside her, years of first response training taking over even as panic screamed underneath it. "Emily, can you hear me, Emily?" Her eyelids fluttered unfocused, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid pulls. Back in the holding cell, Cole heard the commotion through the concrete walls muffled, shouting the scrape of chairs, a woman's voice crying out his daughter's name, and something inside him snapped loose entirely. "Emily!" He was on his feet, slamming both palms against the bars hard enough to rattle the entire frame. "What's happening? Somebody tell me what's happening to my daughter." No one answered him. No one had time to. The ambulance arrived within 6 minutes, but to Cole, locked behind bars 50 feet away from the only person left in this world who mattered to him, it felt like 6 hours. He could hear the gurney wheels. He could hear Tank's voice low and urgent, riding alongside the paramedics. He could not see her. He could not touch her hand. He could not tell her to breathe slow like they'd practiced 1,000 mornings before this one. "Ethan!" Cole's voice tore raw through the holding block. "Ethan, you get me out of this cell right now or so help me." Sheriff Walker appeared at the end of the corridor, his face pale, his hands still shaking from holding Emily's shoulders steady until the paramedics took over. "She's breathing," Ethan said quickly. "She's breathing, Cole. They've got her. They're taking her to Bozeman General. I've got a deputy escort ready. I need 5 minutes and I will personally drive you there myself." 5 minutes might be too late. It won't be. Ethan's jaw was tight, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't fully returned to him since he had found that name on the roster an hour earlier. "I owe your family a debt I can't ever repay, Cole. I am not letting you sit in this cell while your daughter's in an ambulance. Whatever this costs me, I don't care anymore." Cole's hands gripped the bars so tight his knuckles went white. "Then move faster." 20 minutes later, tires screeching into the emergency bay of Bozeman, General Cole Harrison still technically in custody, still technically facing felony charges, flanked by a deputy who had stopped pretending this was a normal transport somewhere around mile marker 12, burst through the hospital doors with a desperation that cleared the waiting room in front of him like a wave. "Emily Harrison," he said to the first nurse he saw, his voice cracking. "Where is she? Please, where's my daughter?" "Sir, are you family?" "I'm her father." The nurse hesitated only a second before nodding toward the double doors. "She's stable. They're running cardiac monitoring now. You can see her in a few minutes, but, sir..." Her eyes flicked briefly to the handcuffs still hanging loose from his belt. Courtesy of Ethan's rushed compromise. "I need you to stay calm in there." Her heart rate spiked badly. "The doctors need quiet." Cole nodded, forcing his breathing to slow through sheer will. The same discipline he'd used 1,000 mornings before, the same discipline that had once kept him alive underwater in a flooded river with 2 strangers' lives in his hands. Behind him, Tank and 4 other members of the club filled the waiting room entirely, a wall of leather and silent solidarity that made the hospital staff exchange uncertain glances, but that made Cole's chest loosen just slightly, knowing his daughter had people who loved her fiercely, even when he couldn't be the one standing beside her. Sheriff Walker stood near the entrance phone pressed to his ear, voice low and urgent. "I don't care what Reyes says," Ethan was saying. "I want that lien pulled apart line by line. Vaughn Development doesn't get to freeze a dying girl's medical account over some manufactured contract dispute. Find out who signed off on that filing, and find out today." On the other end, Noah's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Already on it, Sheriff, and there's something else you need to know. Somebody threatened me this morning. Text message, unknown number telling me to drop the investigation." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "Save it. Screenshot it. We're building a file, Bennett, and it's getting bigger by the hour." "Sheriff," Noah's voice dropped lower, "I think this goes higher than Vaughn acting alone. I think somebody inside our own department is protecting him." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the weight of that sentence settling over him like a stone. "Reyes," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I can't prove it yet, but everything points there. Then get proof, Ethan said, because right now I've got an innocent man in handcuffs, his daughter on a cardiac monitor, and a businessman 2 miles away who thinks none of this can touch him. That ends today. Inside the recovery room, 40 minutes later, Emily's eyes fluttered open to the sight of her father sitting beside her bed, one massive hand wrapped gently around her. Much smaller one, his head bowed, lips moving silently in something that might have been prayer or might have simply been her name, repeated over and over like an anchor. Dad, her voice came out thin, hoarse. His head snapped up instantly. Hey, I'm here, baby. I'm right here. You're not supposed to be here, she whispered, confusion clouding her exhausted eyes. You're supposed to be. Doesn't matter where I'm supposed to be, Cole said, voice breaking. Only place I'm supposed to be is wherever you are. That's the only rule that's ever mattered. Tears slipped down the side of her face into the pillow. They froze the account, Dad. They're trying to take everything. I know. How do we fight that? How do we fight a man with that much money? Cole was quiet for a long moment, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles, his eyes distant, with something that looked almost like resolve hardening into shape. We don't fight him with money, he finally said. We fight him with the truth. And for the first time in 20 years, baby, I've got someone in this town who finally believes me enough to help me find it. Outside the recovery room, Ethan Walker stood with his phone pressed to his ear once more, watching through the small window as a father held his daughter's hand like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had just tried to tear his entire life apart in a single morning. Bennett, Ethan said quietly into the phone, I need everything you've got on Vaughn by tonight. Every filing, every contract, every name connected to that lien and that gas station footage. Because tomorrow morning, I'm not just clearing Cole Harrison's name. He paused, his eyes still fixed on the window on the man who had once pulled his family out of a flood and vanished into the storm before anyone could thank him. Tomorrow morning, I'm making sure the whole town finally knows exactly who Richard Vaughn really is. The hospital room had gone quiet except for the steady rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, and Cole hadn't moved from that plastic chair in over 3 hours, his hands still wrapped around his daughter's, watching the green line on the screen rise and fall like something sacred. The deputy assigned to escort him, a young officer named Diaz, who clearly hadn't signed up for babysitting a felony suspect in a hospital room, stood near the door, arms crossed, glancing at his watch every few minutes, like the shift couldn't end soon enough. Mr. Harrison, Diaz said quietly, careful not to wake Emily. I've got to get you back to the station soon. Sheriff's orders were flexible, not indefinite. She just fell asleep, Cole said, not turning his head. Give me 10 more minutes. I don't have 10 minutes to give you, sir. That was when the door opened and a sharp-featured woman in a gray blazer walked in like she owned the building, a leather folio tucked under one arm, and reading glasses pushed up into short silver-streaked hair. Nobody's taking this man anywhere, she said, not even glancing at Diaz. Denise Whitfield, I'm Mr. Harrison's attorney as of 40 minutes ago. Diaz blinked. Ma'am, he's still in custody. He's in custody on a warrant. I've already filed an emergency motion to challenge based on chain of custody violations your own department documented this morning. She snapped open the folio and held out a stapled document. Judge Ferris signed off on a supervised release 20 minutes ago. Mr. Harrison is free to remain with his daughter tonight. Call your sheriff if you don't believe me. Diaz took the paper, scanned it, and reached for his radio with visible relief. Cole finally looked up. You work fast. I work smart, Denise said, pulling a chair up on the other side of the bed without asking permission from anyone. Ethan Walker called me himself an hour ago, told me everything, told me about Silver Creek. Her eyes softened just slightly, the first real crack in her professional armor. 20 years and nobody in this town ever knew your name until this morning. That's going to change fast, Mr. Harrison, and not all of that change is going to feel good. I don't care how it feels, Cole said. I care about keeping her safe, and I care about the truth getting out before Vaughn buries it under another 6 lawsuits. Then let's talk about that truth, Denise said, lowering her voice. Because what I read in that arrest file this afternoon isn't just sloppy, it's criminal. Somebody manufactured a case against you with real intention, real money, and real coordination. That's not a rich man throwing a tantrum over a land deal. That's a conspiracy. And conspiracies leave fingerprints if you know where to look. Emily stirred slightly in the bed, her eyes fluttering half open. Dad, right here, baby. Is that the lawyer? That's the lawyer, Denise said, offering a small warm smile despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face. And I promise you, Emily, by the time I'm done, this town is going to know exactly who your father really is. 2 miles away, Richard Vaughn sat alone in his office long after his staff had gone home, the glow of his laptop the only light in the room. 3 empty coffee cups lined up beside a legal pad covered in scratched-out numbers. His phone rang. Warren again. The account freeze made the evening news. Warren said, his voice tight with something that hadn't been there this morning. Nerves. Somebody leaked it to a reporter. They're calling it a disabled young woman's medical account. Richard. That's the headline. That's what people are reading right now. Vaughn's jaw tightened. Who leaked it? I don't know. Could have been the bank. Could have been someone at the hospital. Point is, it's out there and it's not landing the way we wanted. It doesn't need to land well. It needs to land, period. Pressure works whether people like it or not. Richard. Warren's voice dropped lower, careful. I altered 3 documents for you this year. I backdated a survey report. I'm a records clerk, not a criminal, and I am starting to feel like a very small man, standing very close to something very large. You're compensated well for standing close to it. I'm compensated to keep paperwork organized. Warren snapped, an edge of panic breaking through. Not to frame an innocent man whose daughter almost died in a hospital waiting room today. That footage of the bikers outside the sheriff's station is already on 3 different social media pages. People are asking questions, Richard. Real questions. And I don't think I can keep answering them for you. Vaughn's silence stretched long enough that Warren nearly hung up, thinking the call had dropped. You'll keep answering them. Vaughn finally said, his voice gone flat and cold. Because you signed your name to falsified documents 18 months ago. And if this comes apart, it comes apart on both of us. Remember that the next time your conscience starts talking louder than your bank account. He ended the call before Warren could respond, set the phone down, and stared at the dark window for a long moment. Across town, in a cramped records office lit by a single desk lamp, Noah Bennett was 3 hours into a stakeout of his own, not of a person, but of paper. Bank statements cross-referenced against county payroll deposits, cross-referenced against Captain Reyes's personal property filings from the last 2 years. What he found made his stomach turn. A truck, paid in full cash 11 months ago, a down payment on a lake house 2 counties over, filed under Reyes's wife's maiden name, but the mortgage cosigner listed a business address that matched almost exactly a shell company Noah had already flagged twice that week, a shell company with filings connected directly back to Vaughn Development Group. Son of a... Noah muttered, snapping a photo of the screen with shaking hands. A shadow fell across the doorway behind him. Working late, Bennett? Noah's entire body went cold. Reyes stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Just finishing up some filing, Captain. Filing. Reyes stepped into the room slowly, deliberately, his eyes flicking to the open documents spread across the desk, documents Noah hadn't had time to close. That doesn't look like filing to me. Noah's mind raced. There was no clean way out of this, no explanation that wouldn't reveal exactly what he'd found. I told you this morning to drop the equipment investigation. Reyes said, his voice low, dangerous in a way Noah had never heard from him before. I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to think very carefully about your answer. Have you dropped it? No, sir. The words came out before Noah could stop them, some stubborn, exhausted part of him refusing to lie one more time in a building that was supposed to stand for the truth. I haven't, and I think you know exactly why I can't. Reyes's face hardened. You're suspended effective immediately. Badge and weapon now. On what grounds? Insubordination, unauthorized access to personnel financial records, which is a violation you just admitted to walking right into. Reyes held out his hand, unmoving. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, son. Noah's hands trembled as he unclipped his badge, but his eyes never left his captain's face. You bought a lake house 11 months ago, Noah said quietly, co-signed and through a company tied to Richard Vaughn. I've got the filing right here. So before you take my badge, Captain, I think you should ask yourself which one of us is really standing on solid ground right now. Reyes's expression flickered just for a fraction of a second, but Noah caught it, the unmistakable crack of a man who knew he'd just been cornered. Get out of this building, Reyes said, voice shaking now with something closer to fear than authority, before I have you arrested for trespassing. Noah didn't argue. He gathered the photographs already saved to his phone, walked past his captain without another word, and didn't stop moving until he was 3 blocks away, breathing hard, dialing a number he hoped would still pick up this late at night. "Sheriff Walker," Ethan answered groggily. "It's Bennett. I got suspended 20 minutes ago." "And Sheriff," Noah's voice shook with adrenaline and something close to triumph, "I think I just found out why Reyes has been protecting Vaughn since the beginning." By the following morning, the story had already begun leaking through Redwood Valley, like water through a cracked dam. The frozen medical account, the bikers standing vigil outside the sheriff's station, a young deputy suspended under murky circumstances, the same night he'd requested sensitive financial records. None of it had been officially confirmed, but in a town this size, official confirmation had never mattered as much as a good rumor delivered over a diner coffee counter. "Heard the sheriff himself drove that biker to the hospital," one waitress murmured to another behind the counter of the Redwood diner. "Heard he practically broke the man out of jail to do it. Heard there's something about a flood years back. Something about the sheriff owing that man his whole family." "Well, whatever it is," the older waitress said, refilling a mug for a farmer at the counter, "something's not sitting right with the Vaughn side of this story. Man's donated to every fundraiser in this county for years, and now suddenly folks are whispering his name different." The farmer at the counter, a weathered man named Hank Delaney, said nothing, staring hard into his coffee, his hands wrapped so tight around the mug, his knuckles had gone pale. Because Hank Delaney knew exactly what had happened to that stolen harvesting equipment. He'd filed the report himself 2 days before Cole's arrest filed it because a man in an expensive suit had shown up on his property 8 months ago with an offer to lease his equipment temporarily for triple its market value. No questions asked, cash. Only contract written so carefully it never once mentioned where the equipment would actually end up. Hank hadn't asked questions because Hank needed the money. His wife's chemotherapy bills didn't care about his conscience. But he hadn't expected any of it to end with an innocent man in handcuffs and his fragile daughter in a hospital bed. That afternoon, a knock came at Hank's door that made his stomach drop before he'd even opened it. Noah Bennett stood on the porch, badge gone, but determination very much intact, a folder tucked under one arm. "Mr. Delaney, I need 5 minutes of your time, and I think you already know why I'm here." Hank's jaw worked silently for a moment. "I've got nothing to say to the sheriff's department." "I'm not with the department anymore," Noah said quietly. "Got suspended last night for asking too many questions about your equipment report, which tells me I was asking the right ones." Hank's eyes flicked past Noah's shoulder, scanning the empty road nervously before he stepped back and let the door swing open. "5 minutes," Hank said, "and you didn't hear any of this from me." Inside, over a kitchen table cluttered with unpaid medical bills, Hank Delaney's carefully maintained silence finally cracked wide open. "A man named Reeves came to me 8 months ago," he said, voice low, shaking slightly. "Said he represented an investment group looking to lease unused outside equipment for a project 2 counties over. Offered me triple the going rate. I needed the money bad, my wife's sick, and I didn't ask enough questions because I couldn't afford to." "Was the equipment actually leased, actually used?" "No," Hank's voice cracked. "It sat in a storage unit outside town for 6 months. Then 2 weeks ago, this same man calls me up, tells me the deal's changed, tells me I need to file a stolen equipment report, or the whole arrangement falls apart and I have to pay back everything I already spent on my wife's treatment." Noah's pulse quickened. "Did you get anything in writing? Any names, any paper trail?" Hank hesitated, then rose from the table, disappearing into a back room before returning with a small metal lockbox. Inside, tucked beneath insurance papers, sat a single business card. Warren Castellano Land Records and Development Consulting. And beneath the printed name and handwriting, Noah recognized instantly from 3 separate falsified documents he'd already flagged that week, a phone number that matched digit for digit the burner phone used to place the anonymous tip against Cole Harrison. "That's him," Noah breathed. "That's the same handwriting on the tip report." Hank swallowed hard. "I didn't know it would go this far. I didn't know some innocent man's little girl would end up in a hospital bed over my equipment lease." "You can fix that," Noah said, sliding a notepad across the table. "But I need you to say all of this on the record, Mr. Delaney, officially, today." Hank stared at the notepad for a long, agonizing moment, the weight of 8 months of silence pressing down on him, harder than any threat Vaughn's people had ever made. "Okay," he finally whispered. "Okay, let's fix it." That evening, Sheriff Ethan Walker sat across a conference table from Judge Ferris, Denise Whitfield beside him. A growing stack of documents spread between them. Falsified reports, financial records linking Reyes to a shell company, and now freshly signed Hank Delaney's sworn statement detailing exactly how the stolen equipment scheme had been engineered from the very beginning. This is enough to dismiss every charge against Cole Harrison, Denise said, tapping the folder firmly. And it's enough to open a criminal investigation into Richard Vaughn, Warren Castellano, and Captain Reyes for conspiracy evidence, tampering, and coercion. Judge Ferris studied the documents in silence for a long moment before looking up, her expression grim. I want charges against Harrison dropped by end of day tomorrow. And Sheriff, her eyes narrowed pointedly at Ethan. I want to know how deep this goes inside your own department before this becomes a much bigger story than a stolen tractor. I intend to find out, Your Honor, Ethan said. Tonight if I have to. But as the meeting broke and Ethan stepped out into the parking lot, phone already in hand, to call Noah with the news, his screen lit up first with a message that made his blood run cold. Unknown number. Warren Castellano didn't show up for his shift tonight. His car's still in the driveway. Nobody's seen him in 6 hours. Ethan's hand tightened around the phone. Across town, in the dim glow of a laptop screen, Richard Vaughn read a very similar message from an entirely different source, and for the first time in 18 months of careful, patient maneuvering, something close to real fear flickered behind his composed expression. Because Warren Castellano knew everything, every falsified document, every payment, every name connected to the scheme that had put an innocent man in handcuffs and nearly cost a young woman her life. And Warren Castellano had just gone completely silent. Vaughn picked up his phone with hands that weren't quite steady and dialed a number he'd sworn he would never need to use. It's me, he said quietly when the call connected. We have a very serious problem, and I need it handled tonight before anyone else finds him first. Orchestrated narrative escalation. Warren's disappearance, Vaughn's arrest, the emotional climax. The phone in Ethan's hand felt heavier than it had any right to feel. He didn't wait for the parking lot to empty. He was already moving toward his cruiser, keyed out, adrenaline burning through 12 hours of exhaustion, like it had never touched him at all. Bennett, he said the second the call connected. Warren Castellano's missing. 6 hours, no contact, car still in his driveway. I think Vaughn just made his first real mistake. Or his smartest one, Noah said, his voice tight with the same dread creeping up Ethan's spine. A missing witness is a lot easier to deal with than a talking one. Where would he run? He wouldn't run, Noah said. Guy like Warren records clerk quiet life, no criminal history. Until 18 months ago, he's not built for running. Somebody either scared him into hiding or somebody already got to him. Ethan's knuckles went white around the steering wheel. Family. Does he have family in the area? Sister lives out past the county line, small property near Miller's Creek. I can be there in 15 minutes. I'll meet you there in 10. The drive out to Miller's Creek passed in a blur of dark fields and flickering porch lights. Ethan's mind refusing to sit still, cycling relentlessly between Emily's pale face in that hospital bed and the cold, clinical tone he'd heard in Vaughn's voice through Warren's own retelling of past conversations. We have a very serious problem, and I need it handled tonight. Handled. Like a man was inventory. Like 20 years of careful, patient cruelty had finally reached the point where erasing a person felt like the easiest solution left on the table. Noah's truck was already parked crookedly in the gravel when Ethan pulled up, engine still ticking, driver's door hanging open. Sheriff, Noah's voice cracked through the dark, urgent from somewhere near the tree line behind the house. Over here now. Ethan's hand dropped instinctively to his sidearm as he ran, boots pounding across frost-hardened grass, every worst possibility flashing through his mind in the space of 6 seconds. What he found stopped him cold. Warren Castellano was alive, curled against the base of an old oak tree, knees pulled to his chest, a flashlight shaking in one trembling hand, his sister standing over him with a shotgun aimed steadily at the darkness beyond the property line. Don't come any closer, she snapped, swinging the barrel toward Ethan before recognizing the uniform. Sheriff Walker. It's me, Donna. Lower that thing before somebody gets hurt. Donna's arms shook as she finally dropped the shotgun to her side, her breath coming in ragged gasps. 2 men showed up at his apartment tonight. He barely got out the back window before they broke the door down. He's been hiding in my yard for 3 hours, too scared to even call anybody. Warren's eyes lifted slowly, hollow, terrified, the polished confidence of a county records clerk completely stripped away. They were going to kill me, he whispered. Sheriff, they were going to kill me tonight. Ethan crouched down slowly, keeping his voice level despite the fury building behind his ribs. You're safe now, Warren. Nobody's touching you. But I need you to tell me everything right now before those men figure out where you ran to. Warren's hands wouldn't stop shaking. If I talk, Vaughn will bury me. He has people everywhere. Judges, bankers. Half the county commission owes him something. And if you don't talk, Noah said quietly, kneeling beside him, an innocent man stays branded, a criminal. His daughter keeps getting targeted, and the next time Vaughn decides somebody's a liability, it might not stop at breaking down a door. Warren squeezed his eyes shut, and for a long, brutal moment, nobody spoke. Somewhere in the dark trees behind them, an owl called out, and Donna flinched so hard the shotgun nearly slipped from her grip again. Okay, Warren finally said, his voice cracking wide open. Okay, I'll tell you everything. But you have to get me somewhere safe first. Tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight. Done, Ethan said. You're coming with me. 20 minutes later, in a locked interview room at a station 2 counties away, deliberately chosen, deliberately far from anywhere Reyes could interfere. Warren Castellano sat across from Ethan and Noah with a bottle of water he hadn't touched and a folder of documents he'd apparently kept hidden in a safety deposit box for exactly this kind of night. Insurance, he said quietly, sliding the folder across the table. I knew this day might come eventually. Figured if it did, I wasn't going down alone. Inside were names, dates, wire transfers, a pattern stretching back nearly 4 years long before Cole Harrison had ever refused to sell his land. Other farmers, other families, other small pieces of Redwood Valley quietly bullied, sabotaged, and forced into selling for a fraction of what their land was actually worth. He's done this before, Ethan said, flipping through pages with growing horror. Vaughn's done this to other people. 6 other properties, Warren confirmed, all bought under market value, all through pressure campaigns that never quite crossed into anything provable until Cole Harrison refused to break the way everyone before him did. That's when things got sloppy. That's when Reyes got involved directly because Vaughn needed someone inside the department who could make evidence disappear and appear on command. How much is Reyes involved? Warren's jaw tightened. Enough that if this goes public, he's not walking away with a suspension. He's looking at prison. Noah leaned forward, adrenaline sharpening his voice. This is enough, Sheriff. This is more than enough to bring in the state attorney general's office tonight. Ethan was already reaching for his phone, but Warren grabbed his wrist, eyes wide with fresh panic. There's one more thing, Warren said. Something you need to know before you make that call. Vaughn's not planning to wait around while all of this falls apart around him. I heard him on the phone 2 nights ago. He's got a private plane fueled and ready at the regional airstrip. If he thinks this is closing in on him, he's not sticking around to face it. Ethan's blood ran cold. When? Could be tonight. Could be tomorrow morning. But if you don't move fast, Sheriff, he's going to be sitting on a beach somewhere by the time anyone can stop him. Ethan was on his feet instantly, phone already pressed to his ear, dialing the state attorney general's emergency line with hands that had gone rock steady the moment purpose replaced panic. This is Sheriff Ethan Walker, Redwood Valley County. I need an emergency warrant issued within the hour, and I need it flagged for immediate execution. We have a flight risk. Back at Bozeman, General Cole sat beside Emily's bed in the low hum of monitors, unaware of the storm gathering 2 counties away. His entire world narrowed down to the steady rhythm of his daughter's breathing and the exhausted, fragile smile she gave him every time she woke to check that he hadn't left. You should sleep, Emily murmured, her voice thick with fatigue. You look terrible. Seen worse mornings, Cole said, managing a tired half smile. Trust me. Dad, her hand tightened weakly around his. Is this really going to end, or is he just going to keep coming after us no matter what? Cole was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully, unwilling to make a promise he wasn't certain he could keep. I don't know everything that's happening out there tonight, he admitted, but I know Ethan Walker's out there fighting for us like we're his own family, and I know men like Vaughn only win when good people stay quiet. Nobody in this town is staying quiet anymore. Outside the room, Tank Morrison stood watch in the hallway, arms crossed, a silent sentinel who hadn't left the hospital in over 18 hours. 3 other club members rotating shifts beside him through the night. When a nurse asked if they intended to camp out in her hallway indefinitely, Tank had simply looked at her and said, Yes, ma'am, exactly that. and she hadn't argued further. At 4:47 in the morning, Richard Vaughn's phone rang, jolting him from a shallow, restless sleep on the couch in his office. "It's done," a voice said on the other end, low-controlled. "Castellano's gone." Relief flooded through Vaughn's chest for exactly 4 seconds before the voice continued. "Gone from his sister's property, not gone permanently. Sheriff Walker got to him first. He's in protective custody now, 2 counties over, and word is he handed over documentation going back years." Vaughn's entire body went rigid. "How much documentation?" "Enough from what I'm hearing. Enough to connect the equipment scheme, the lien filing Reyes, all of it. There's already a warrant request moving through the state AG's office." Vaughn was on his feet instantly, adrenaline burning away the last traces of exhaustion, his mind racing through 18 months of careful architecture, collapsing in real time. "Get the plane fueled," he said. "Now. Richard, if you run it, confirms every single thing they're accusing you of. Right now, you've still got lawyers, still got plausible deniability on half of this. You run, you lose all of it." "I'm not going to prison over a tractor in some farmland," Vaughn snapped. "Fuel the plane." But even as he grabbed his coat, even as he shoved documents into a leather bag, with hands that had never once shaken in 18 years of ruthless business dealings, a small, cold voice in the back of his mind reminded him of something he'd conveniently forgotten in the panic of the last 10 minutes. Airports had cameras. Airports had flight logs. And sheriffs with 20-year-old debts to repay did not forget the names of private airstrips easily. By the time Vaughn's car turned onto the access road leading to the regional airstrip 40 minutes later, 3 unmarked vehicles were already waiting, engines dark headlights off, positioned in a loose perimeter around the small hangar where his plane sat fueled and ready. Vaughn's car slowed to a stop 100 yards out. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Sheriff Ethan Walker stepped out from behind his cruiser, flanked by 2 state investigators in windbreakers marked with bold yellow lettering, his expression carved from something harder and more final than anything Vaughn had seen on him during their handful of pleasant fundraiser conversations over the years. Vaughn rolled down his window slowly. "Sheriff, bit early for a friendly visit, isn't it?" "Step out of the car, Mr. Vaughn." "On what grounds?" Ethan held up a folded warrant, the paper trembling slightly in the cold morning wind. "Fraud, extortion, conspiracy to tamper with evidence, coercion, and attempted witness tampering, which, given the 2 men who broke down Warren Castellano's door tonight, is about to become a very serious felony charge in about 30 seconds if you don't step out of that car right now." Vaughn's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his mind racing through options that were narrowing by the second plane 50 yards away, engine running pilot waiting freedom close enough to almost taste. "I have lawyers who will tear this warrant apart within the hour," Vaughn said, forcing calm into his voice that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Then you can explain that to them from a holding cell," Ethan said. "Same one you had an innocent man sitting in yesterday morning. Funny how that works out." For one long, suspended moment, Vaughn's foot hovered near the gas pedal, some desperate, cornered animal instinct, calculating whether 40 yards of open tarmac was worth the risk. Then the sound of a second vehicle's engine roared to life behind him, blocking the access road entirely, and the calculation collapsed under the simple, undeniable math of being surrounded. Vaughn opened the car door slowly and stepped out. Hands raised, his composure cracking for the first time in 18 months of careful, untouchable control. "This is a mistake," he said quietly, almost to himself, as the cuffs clicked, shut around his wrists. "I built half this county's economy. Do you understand what you're doing right now?" "I understand exactly what I'm doing," Ethan said, his voice steadied 20 years of grief and gratitude and fury, finally finding somewhere useful to land. "I'm doing my job, something I should have done a long time before yesterday." As deputies guided Vaughn toward the waiting cruiser, his eyes caught Ethan's one final time, something calculating, still flickering behind the fear. "Reyes will bury half of this before it reaches a courtroom," Vaughn said quietly. "You think this ends with me?" Ethan leaned in close, his voice dropping low enough that only Vaughn could hear it. "Reyes is already in a room 3 doors down from where you're headed. Has been for the last 20 minutes. Funny thing about cornered men, Mr. Vaughn. They all start talking eventually, and they never much care who they take down with them on the way." Something in Vaughn's expression finally fully broke. Back at the county station in a separate interview room, lit by the same harsh fluorescent glow, that had once framed Cole Harrison's arrest, Captain Reyes sat with his hands folded on the table, his career, his marriage, and the lake house sitting on a shell company he thought no one would ever trace, all collapsing in real time, in front of a state investigator with a folder full of Warren Castellano's documents. "I want to talk about my family," Reyes said quietly, his voice hollow. "Whatever this costs me, I wanted to stay away from my wife." "That depends entirely on how honest you're willing to be right now," the investigator said. "Start talking, Captain, and start with why you suspended a deputy for asking the exact questions that should have been asked 18 months ago." By the time the sun rose fully over Redwood Valley, casting pale gold light across frost-covered fields, the story that had begun with 6 sheriff's cruisers descending on a biker's ranch had transformed into something the entire county would be talking about for years to come. A wealthy developer in handcuffs, a corrupt captain facing his own arraignment, and a records clerk whose quiet act of self-preservation had unraveled 4 years of calculated cruelty in a single sleepless night. At the hospital, Cole was still sitting beside Emily's bed when his phone buzzed with a text from Ethan that made his chest tighten with something he hadn't let himself feel in over 24 hours. "It's over. Vaughn's in custody. Reyes, too. Charges against you are being formally dismissed this afternoon." "You did nothing wrong, Cole. Never did." Cole read the message twice, his throat tightening, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered the phone. "Dad?" Emily's voice was groggy but alert, watching his face carefully. "What is it? What happened?" Cole looked up at his dog's 21 years old. Fragile heart and fierce spirit, the only reason he'd gotten out of bed every single morning for the last 11 years, and for the first time since deputies had cuffed his wrists in front of half the town, he allowed himself to fully exhale. "It's over, baby," he said, voice breaking. "It's finally over." Emily's eyes filled with tears, relief and exhaustion and disbelief tangling together all at once. "They believe you now. Everybody knows. Everybody's about to," Cole said quietly, glancing toward the hallway where Tank and the others stood waiting, where a sheriff who owed him a debt 20 years overdue was already fighting battles Cole hadn't even known needed fighting. But even as relief settled heavy and warm across his chest, some old hard-earned instinct kept one corner of his mind sharp, cautious, unwilling to fully relax. Because men like Richard Vaughn didn't build empires on borrowed money and stolen land without insurance policies of their own, and somewhere in Redwood Valley, buried in a filing cabinet, or a private account, or a favor owed by someone still wearing a badge. Cole had a quiet, gnawing feeling that Vaughn's arrest wasn't quite the ending anyone in that hospital room was hoping it would be. Cole's instinct proved right within 48 hours. Denise Whitfield's phone rang at 6 in the morning, and by the tightness in her voice when she called Ethan 20 minutes later, he knew before she said a word that this wasn't over yet. "Vaughn's lawyers filed an emergency motion overnight," she said, papers rustling audibly on her end of the line. "They're claiming the warrant that led to his airstrip arrest was improperly obtained. Says the state investigators moved on Warren Castellano's testimony before it was formally sworn, which technically," she exhaled hard, "technically might hold up. If a judge agrees, everything collected after that point gets thrown out. The equipment scheme, the lien, maybe even the charges against Reyes." Ethan's stomach dropped. "And Cole, if the motion succeeds, the original charges against Cole don't automatically come back, but it opens the door for Vaughn's team to argue the whole case was tainted from the start. They'll drag this out in appeals for years if they have to. Rich men don't go down easy, Ethan. You know that." Standing in the hospital hallway, phone pressed hard against his ear, Ethan felt something in his chest that hadn't shown up since Silver Creek, the particular helpless fury of watching an injustice slip through his fingers after finally believing he'd caught it. "There has to be something," he said, "some way to close that hole before a judge even looks at it." "There's one thing," Denise said carefully. "Hank Delaney's sworn statement was taken separately hours before the airstrip arrest. Clean chain, no procedural issues. If his testimony alone is strong enough to stand on its own, it doesn't matter what happens to the Castellano evidence. We build the whole case around Delaney instead." "Is it strong enough?" Denise was quiet for a moment. "It has to be. Because right now, Ethan, it's the only ground we've got left that Vaughn's lawyers can't touch." 2 hours later, in a windowless conference room at the courthouse, Hank Delaney sat across from Denise and a state prosecutor named Alvarez, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone bloodless. His wife Carol seated beside him, her oxygen tank humming quietly at her side, her chemotherapy port still visible beneath the collar of her cardigan. "If I testify in open court," Hank said, voice unsteady, "Vaughn's people already came after Warren once. What's stopping them from coming after me after Carol?" "We can offer protective measures," Alvarez said. "But Mr. Delaney, I'll be honest with you. The strength of your testimony might be the difference between this entire case collapsing and an innocent man's name staying cleared permanently. I can't promise you comfort. I can only promise you that silence hasn't protected you so far, and it's not likely to start now." Carol reached over and took her husband's trembling hand, her voice softer than the fear thick in the room. "Hank, we took that money because we were scared and desperate, and it almost cost a young woman her life. I love you, but we don't get to hide from that anymore. Not now." Hank's eyes filled, and for a long moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hiss of Carol's oxygen. "Okay," he finally said, voice breaking. "I'll testify, whatever it takes." 3 days later, the courtroom in downtown Redwood Valley filled to capacity. For the first time in over a decade, spectators packed shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. Reporters from 3 regional outlets crowded near the door, and in the front row, Emily Harrison sat between Tank Morrison and Sheriff Ethan Walker, her hand gripping her father's tightly as Cole took his seat at the defense table beside Denise, his massive frame looking almost too large for the small wooden chair. Vaughn sat 2 tables away, flanked by 3 attorneys in tailored suits, his composure carefully rebuilt. Overnight, his expression a mask of wounded dignity that made Emily's jaw clench with fury, just looking at him. "All rise." The judge entered, and the room fell into a hush so complete Emily could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Hank Delaney took the stand, first hands shaking as he was sworn in, his eyes flicking nervously toward Vaughn's table before settling with visible effort on the prosecutor. "Mr. Delaney," Alvarez began gently, "can you describe in your own words how you came to file a false stolen equipment report against Cole Harrison?" Hank's voice cracked on the first sentence, but by the third, something steadied in him, the same quiet resolve Cole had shown 11 years earlier, choosing his daughter's life over every dollar Vaughn had ever offered him. "A man named Warren Castellano approached me 8 months ago," Hank said. "Offered me triple market rate to lease my equipment to an investment group. No questions asked, cash only. 6 months later, he told me I needed to report it stolen, said it was part of the arrangement, said if I didn't, I'd owe back every dollar I'd already spent on my wife's cancer treatment." A murmur rippled through the gallery. "And did you know at the time that this false report would be used to frame Cole Harrison?" "No," Hank said, voice cracking further. "God, no, I didn't know any of that until it was already done. And when I found out," his eyes found Cole's across the courtroom hall with shame, "when I found out an innocent man's daughter ended up in a hospital because of what I signed off on, I couldn't live with staying quiet anymore." Vaughn's lead attorney rose for cross-examination, circling questions designed to paint Hank as an unreliable witness driven by guilt and financial desperation. But Hank held steady, repeating the same simple truth over and over with a kind of exhausted, unshakable honesty that no amount of legal maneuvering could dismantle. By the time Warren Castellano took the stand that afternoon, testifying under heavy protective escort, his voice thin but resolute as he laid out 4 years of falsified documents, backdated surveys, and a paper trail leading directly to Vaughn's signature on wire transfers meant to look like consulting fees. The courtroom's mood had shifted from curious spectacle to something closer to open outrage. "Objection," Vaughn's attorney called out repeatedly. "Speculation. Hearsay. Overruled," the judge said, each time her patience visibly thinning. By the final morning of testimony, when Captain Reyes himself took the stand under a plea agreement that traded his own reduced sentence for full cooperation, admitting under oath that he had personally destroyed exculpatory evidence and threatened a subordinate deputy to protect Vaughn's operation, the outcome had become almost a formality. "I want it stated clearly," Reyes said, his voice hollow, staring straight ahead rather than meeting anyone's eyes in that courtroom. "Cole Harrison never stole anything, never touched that equipment. Every piece of evidence used against him was manufactured, and I personally helped bury the proof that would have cleared him within hours of his arrest." Emily's hand tightened so hard around her father's that her knuckles went white, tears streaming freely down her face as, for the first time in 5 agonizing days, she let herself believe this might truly finally be over. The judge's ruling came down 2 hours later. All charges against Cole Harrison are dismissed with prejudice, effective immediately, she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. The court further orders that Mr. Harrison's record be expunged of any reference to this case and formally acknowledges the extraordinary courage shown by witnesses who came forward at considerable personal risk. The gallery erupted not with the raucous cheering of a sporting event, but with something quieter and heavier. Dozens of people who had once whispered ugly things about a biker in a leather vest now standing, some crying, some simply staring in stunned silence at the man they realized they had judged so completely, so wrongly for 11 long years. Cole didn't move for a long moment, his massive shoulders shaking slightly, Denise's hand resting gently on his arm. Then Emily was there, arms wrapped around his neck, sobbing into his shoulder, and Cole finally allowed himself to break. Holding his daughter like the entire terrifying week had never happened, like the only thing that had ever truly mattered was this exact moment. "It's over, Dad," Emily whispered. "It's really over." "It's over," Cole agreed, voice thick with emotion he'd kept locked down for 5 brutal days. "We're okay, baby. We're finally okay." 2 tables away, Richard Vaughn sat frozen as the judge continued her tone, turning sharp and final as she addressed the second half of the docket. As for the defendant, Richard Vaughn, on charges of conspiracy, fraud, extortion, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation, she paused, letting the weight of the moment settle fully. This court finds sufficient grounds to proceed to full trial and orders the defendant remanded without bail, given documented evidence of flight risk. Vaughn's face went ashen. His attorneys erupted into hushed, urgent conversation, but the judge's gavel came down with a finality that no amount of billable hours could undo. As bailiffs approached to escort him from the courtroom, Vaughn's eyes swept the room one final time, landing on Cole, on Emily, on the man in the leather vest he had spent 18 months trying to destroy. "You think this changes anything?" Vaughn said, his voice low, bitter, stripped of every polished veneer he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. "You think this town's grateful now? Give it a year. They'll forget your name again." Cole met his gaze steadily, without a trace of the anger Vaughn seemed to be searching for. "Maybe," Cole said quietly, "but at least now they'll know the truth when they do." The bailiffs led Vaughn away, and for the first time in 18 months, Redwood Valley watched the man who had quietly terrorized their community walk out of a courtroom in handcuffs instead of walking free through a fundraiser gala. 6 weeks later, on a bright, cold Saturday morning, the Redwood Valley Community Center filled to capacity for a town meeting that had been announced in only 3 days earlier. The flyer, simple and unadorned, a conversation with our community, Sheriff Ethan Walker. Cole hadn't planned to attend, Emily had insisted. "You need to hear this," she'd told him that morning, tugging her cardigan tighter against the winter chill, her color fuller now, her strength returning steadily with each passing week of stability and rest. "Not because you need an apology, because this town needs to hear it out loud together so nobody forgets." They sat near the back tank, and 3 other club members flanking them protectively out of old habit, though the tension that once followed the roar of their motorcycles through town had noticeably softened in recent weeks. People who once crossed the street now offered small nods. A few even smiled. Ethan stood at the front of the room without his uniform jacket, just a plain flannel shirt, looking less like a lawman and more like an ordinary man carrying an extraordinary weight. 11 years ago, he began, voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "A man moved into this valley wearing a leather vest, and this town decided who he was before he ever said a single word. I decided who he was. I want to own that publicly because it matters." He paused, gathering himself. 20 years before that, during the Silver Creek flood, my wife and my 6-year-old son were trapped in a sinking car. I wasn't there. I was 3 miles away, helpless, listening to reports on a radio that told me nobody was coming in time. And then somebody did come. A stranger pulled them out of that water with his bare hands, went under 3 times to get my son's seatbelt free, and vanished into the storm before I ever got his name. The room had gone completely still. For 20 years, I believed that man was gone, maybe dead. I searched quietly for years, and I never found him. Ethan's voice cracked slice-on. Then 11 days ago, I put handcuffs on him in his own front yard in front of half this town because I judged him by a patch on his vest instead of the truth in his heart. Emily felt her father's hand tighten in hers. "I judged a man by what he wore instead of what he had done," Ethan said, his voice breaking fully now. And I think most of us in this room did the same thing in one way or another for 11 straight years. Cole Harrison never asked for recognition, never asked for thanks. He just showed up every single day, took care of his daughter, took care of his brothers, and took care of this community in ways none of us bothered to notice, because we were too busy being afraid of how he looked. He turned searching the crowd until his eyes found Cole in the back row. "I owe you an apology that 11 years in a courtroom verdict can't fully repay," Ethan said. "But I'm standing here in front of everyone saying it anyway. I'm sorry, Cole, for 11 years of assumptions, for the morning I put you in handcuffs instead of thanking you the way I should have 20 years ago." The room turned, nearly 200 faces swiveling toward the back row, and for a long, suspended moment, Cole simply sat there, jaw tight, emotions warring visibly across his weathered face. Then he stood. The room held its breath. "I don't need an apology," Cole said, his voice carrying clearly despite its rough edges. "What I needed was for people to look a little closer before they decided who I was. Ethan did that eventually. That's more than most people ever bother to do." He looked around slowly at the crowd neighbors who had whispered about him for over a decade, farmers who had avoided his eyes at the feed store, women who had pulled their children a little closer whenever his motorcycle rumbled past. "I'm not angry," Cole continued. "I understand fear. I understand judgment. What I hope now is that maybe next time somebody rides into this valley looking different than what you're used to, you'll remember this morning before you decide what kind of man he is." Applause broke out slowly, tentatively, then swelled into something warm and sustained. Dozens of people rising to their feet, and Emily watched with tears streaming freely down her face as her father, the man the whole town had once feared, the man who had spent 11 years quietly proving his worth without ever once asking for credit, finally fully received it. After the meeting, as the crowd slowly dispersed into the cold afternoon, an older woman approached Cole, hesitantly wringing her hands. "Mr. Harrison," she said, voice trembling slightly, "I'm Margaret Ellery. I run the church food pantry. I want you to know I was one of the people who used to say ugly things about your club. I'm ashamed of that now." Cole studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. "Appreciate you saying so, ma'am. Takes courage to admit that." "My grandson's having some trouble at school," Margaret said, hesitating. "Getting picked on mostly because his father's in prison and people assume the worst about him too. I don't suppose bring him by the ranch sometime," Cole said, not missing a beat. "Kid needs to learn to ride a horse. He's welcome. Kid needs somebody who won't judge him for things he didn't choose. He's got that too." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, thanking him quietly before disappearing back into the crowd. Tank, standing nearby, clapped Cole on the shoulder with a knowing grin. "Told you this town would come around eventually. Took a felony arrest and a hospital stay to get there," Cole said dryly. "Not exactly the scenic route." "No," Tank agreed, glancing toward Emily, who stood laughing softly with two other club members near the exit, color back in her cheeks, strength back in her stance. "But we made it." 6 months later, Richard Vaughn's trial concluded with a conviction on all major counts: fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and witness tampering, a sentence of 14 years handed down by a judge who cited specifically the deliberate targeting of a family already burdened by medical hardship as an aggravating factor. Warren Castellano, in exchange for his full cooperation, received a suspended sentence and immediately relocated out of state, though he sent Cole a handwritten letter of apology that Cole kept folded in his desk drawer, not out of sentiment, but as a quiet reminder of how close silence had come to costing everything. Reyes served 18 months for evidence tampering and obstruction, his badge revoked permanently, his name quietly removed from department records except in the training materials. Ethan personally insisted on creating a case study on how easily institutional trust could be corrupted when convenience was allowed to outweigh conscience. Hank Delaney's wife Carol finished her chemotherapy that spring. Cole showed up at their farm unannounced one afternoon with 3 of his club brothers and 2 truckloads of lumber, silently rebuilding a collapsed section of Hank's barn roof without ever mentioning the debt Hank clearly still felt he owed. "You don't have to do this," Hank had said, standing in his yard, throat tight with emotion. "Not doing it because I have to," Cole replied, hoisting a beam onto his shoulder. "Doing it because that's what neighbors do when they finally start acting like neighbors." By late spring, Emily's health had stabilized more than her doctors had predicted, the stress of the previous year finally behind her color and strength, returning steadily with each passing month. She enrolled that fall in an agricultural management program at the State University's Extension campus, 40 minutes from the ranch, determined to learn everything necessary to run the family land herself, one day driven by a fierce, quiet pride that had only deepened since the trial. "You sure about this?" Cole asked her one evening, watching her spread textbooks and soil charts across the kitchen table, where he'd once laid out her medication bottles every single morning. "I've spent my whole life watching you fight for this land," Emily said, not looking up from her notes. "Time I learned how to fight for it, too." Cole said nothing for a long moment, simply watching his daughter with a pride so full it nearly ached in his chest. 1 year to the day after 6 sheriff's cruisers had rolled up the gravel drive of Cole Harrison's ranch, the same driveway filled instead with motorcycles, pickup trucks, and the warm, easy noise of a weekend barbecue. Smoke curled up from a grill manned by Tank, who had appointed himself unofficial pitmaster for the occasion, despite 3 separate complaints about his seasoning technique. Emily moved through the gathering with genuine ease, laughing freely, healthier and steadier than she'd been in years, occasionally stopping to show off notes from her latest agricultural coursework to anyone patient enough to listen. Sheriff Ethan Walker arrived that afternoon without his uniform, without his cruiser. Just an ordinary man in jeans and a jacket, carrying a case of soda under one arm and an unmistakable ease in his posture that hadn't been there a year earlier. "No badge today?" Cole asked, meeting him near the porch steps. "Didn't figure I needed it," Ethan said. "Wasn't coming as the sheriff, just coming to thank a friend." Cole studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, extending a hand that Ethan shook firmly. "Kids are inside," Ethan added. "Wanted to meet the man their old man never stopped talking about." "Figured it was about time." Cole's chest tightened with something warm and unfamiliar, the particular quiet satisfaction of watching a debt paid not in money but in decades of buried gratitude finally allowed to surface into daylight. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low over the valley and the noise of the gathering softened into easy conversation and the low hum of someone's guitar, Cole stood near the fence line, watching his daughter laugh with old friends and new ones, watching his brothers swap stories with neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid them, watching Ethan Walker's children chase fireflies across a lawn that 1 year ago had been crawling with deputies in handcuffs and fear. For years, the world had seen a dangerous biker. The sheriff had seen a suspect. The town had seen a frightening patch stitched across the back of a leather vest. But those who had taken the time to truly know Cole Harrison saw something else entirely: a father who had sacrificed everything without complaint, a brother who never once abandoned the people who needed him, a hero who had never once asked to be called one. Because the most important patch a man carries isn't the one stitched onto the back of his vest. It's the one stitched quietly, permanently into the very fabric of his heart, loyalty, sacrifice, and love strong enough to outlast every judgment the world tries to place upon it. And in Redwood Valley, that truth would never again be forgotten.